His name was Alan Bond, and for a moment, he looked like the future of Australian business. Bond bankrolled the yacht that smashed America's 132-year America's Cup winning streak. He became the face of a national victory. And for a while, Alan Bond wasn't just rich. He was Australian confidence personified. Then, less than a decade later, the same man was bankrupt. Not mildly embarrassed, and not temporarily short of cash. Bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and eventually imprisoned. Alan Bond was colourful, and Alan Bond lived big, and his story shows one of the more illustrious rise and falls in the annals of business history. If you're new here, I'm Tristan, and this is Professor Punch. It's built by entrepreneurs and legal professionals who help train staff and advisors around family offices and high net worth individuals. It's not legal advice. It's legal competence for entrepreneurs, operators, and investors. And today, the lesson comes through the bombastic rise and extreme fall of Alan Bond. Bond's story starts far away from the boardrooms. He was born in England and moved to Australia young. He didn't come from the polished end of town. He worked and he sold, and he learned how to persuade people before he ever learned how to persuade banks. Bond wasn't an accountant's idea of businessman. He was a salesman operator. He understood the emotional side of a deal, and he understood the importance of confidence. In business, people often buy the future before the future exists. Bond had an instinct for selling that future. That skill was powerful. In the right moment, it can build a fortune. In the wrong moment, it can make a man believe in his own momentum. But momentum is a cruel mistress. Bond moved into property and began building. Not quietly, and certainly not modestly. He had that particular 1980s appetite for visible success. Real estate was the perfect arena. It has a way of making the success visible. Debt made the growth faster, as it tends to do, and a rising market made Alan Bond look like a genius. By the time most Australians knew his name, Bond had already built the basic framework. Then came the yacht. The America's Cup, sailing's most illustrious and coveted prize. It had been held by the New York Yacht Club for 132 years. For Australians, this was more than just a race. It was the old world, sitting on the trophy and assuming nobody else could touch it. But in 1983, Bond's Australia 2 yacht won, and the country went mad with excitement. Alan Bond stood in the middle of the national celebration. It was the kind of victory that becomes larger than itself. People who'd never cared about sailing suddenly cared deeply. You know the type of event. The trophy had been taken from the old guard. Bond understood the power of that moment. He wasn't only attached to a winning boat, but he was attached to a national feeling. That feeling made him bigger. It made his ambition feel patriotic, and it made his appetite feel like proof that Australia had finally stopped asking for permission. The victory changed the way people saw him. He wasn't just another successful rich guy. He was the man who backed the boat that beat the establishment. Bond kept climbing. He moved through property, brewing, media, resources, art, and prestige assets. Every new purchase seemed to confirm the last one. The brewing business made him even more visible. By the mid-1980s, Bond's interests reached into major beer assets, including Castlemaine Tooheys, a major international brewer. Brewing meant pubs, sport, television, and Bond was collecting prized national assets and pushing his way into the national bloodstream. Then came Bond University, a private university carrying his name. Legacy building can be useful, and Bond seemed to understand that. But it can also make an operator start thinking in monuments, instead of margins. Then there was Channel 9, a major TV and media entity. This was the kind of asset that bought influence. Television shaped the room the country lived in. If you owned the network, you owned part of the national conversation. So when Bond sat down with Kerry Packer, another Australian billionaire, he wasn't simply buying cash flow. He was buying assets at the highest level of Australian business. Buying Channel 9 from Kerry Packer was not a normal transaction. It was business theatre, with two enormous characters on stage. Packer was one of the sharpest business minds in Australia. He understood price and timing, and he understood when a buyer wanted something badly enough to overpay. Bond wanted Channel 9. The price was enormous. The symbolism was even bigger. Alan Bond, the self-made national hero, would own one of the greatest media assets in the country. The deal has become business folklore. Packer sold the network at the top. Bond later had to sell it back to him after the empire had turned against him. That's the thing about trophy deals. They're not dangerous because they're glamorous. They're dangerous because glamour can hide the carrying cost. A seller gets cash, and a buyer gets debt, obligations, assumptions, and the problem of making the future arrive on time. For a while, the future did arrive on time for people like Bond. That was the trick of the 1980s. Credit was available, assets were rising, people believed bigger was safer because bigger kept working. But bigger is not safer. Bigger is just bigger. In 1987, he also bought Van Gogh's irises for a record prize. It was one of those purchases that told the world, this man isn't just rich, he's operating in another category. By the late 1980s, the world around Bond began to change. Credit became less forgiving, and asset values came under pressure. Deals that once looked bold started looking heavy. Bond would ultimately spend more time managing a collapse than building the business. This is often the first sign the machine has turned around. The empire that once amplified Bond's ambition now demanded rescue from every direction. The empire needed confidence to keep moving, but confidence is not cash. And when cash tightens, what's underneath begins to matter more than personality. That is the moment every highly leveraged operator eventually faces. The moment when charm stops being the main language in the room. The lenders don't want the story anymore. They just want to know what they can reach. One of the crucial pieces for Bond was a personal guarantee. This wasn't just corporate debt sitting safely inside the company. Bond had personally guaranteed loans connected to corporate projects. The bank said he owed about 195 million Australian dollars under those guarantees. In Bond's case, the relevant personal guarantee was tied to loans used for the Greenvale nickel project in Queensland. The creditor banks reportedly claimed that Bond personally owed about 195 million Australian dollars under guarantees that he gave to secure loans for Dolehold Investments, his family company. Bond argued that the banks had assured him the guarantees would not be enforced, but the guarantees became part of the pressure that led to his personal bankruptcy in 1992. Bond's assets, estate, future income, and ability to survive were all at risk. A personal guarantee can be so dangerous for this reason. It can turn a company problem into a personal catastrophe. Anyway, in 1992, Bond was declared bankrupt after failing to meet this very large personal guarantee. This is one of the first quiet lessons in Bond's story. A founder should never sign a personal guarantee while at the same time treating it like a formality. It might be commercial, it might be necessary, it might even be worth it, but it should never be considered a mere formality. Then there was Bell. Bell was not some side note. It became one of the largest and longest running corporate sagas in Australian business history. Bond had acquired Bell Group from Robert Holmes, another really rich guy in Australia. It was another major acquisition inside an already stretched empire. Bond acquired control of Bell Group in 1988, about 4 years before he would ultimately file for bankruptcy. The acquisition was through Bond Corporation. The structure was initially a joint move involving Bond Corporation and the State Government Insurance Commission. But Bond Corporation was later forced to bid for additional shares and ended up with a majority position of about 68%. Distressed empires have a habit of turning acquisitions into rescue tools. The asset you bought for growth can become the asset you reach for when the center starts failing. Bond's connection with Bell Resources and the wider Bell Group became one of the central pieces of the collapse. And the details stayed complex for years. Receivers, banks, liquidators, governments, creditors, and courts. The legal aftermath outlived it all for years. This is another hidden cost of bad structure. The deal may take months. Bond later pleaded guilty in relation to moving funds from Bell Resources into Bond Corporation. The prosecution case was that those funds were used to support the failing Bond Corporation. This is the hard center of the story. Not the yacht, not the champagne, not the newspaper photographs, the movement of money across legal boundaries under pressure. This is where business law becomes brutally real. A company is not just a label on a bank account. It's a legal person with its own interests, duties, creditors, and records. You may have built it. You may control it. You may feel emotionally that the whole group is yours. But if the law says one company's money cannot simply be used to rescue another, your feelings do not matter. Rescue mode feels noble. You're saving the business. You're protecting jobs. You're buying time. You're trying to keep the dream alive. But rescue mode is legally dangerous because it makes the founder impatient with boundaries. And under pressure, every legal boundary becomes load-bearing. If you move the wrong money, sign the wrong document, give the wrong assurance, or use the wrong entity, you may not simply create a commercial problem. You may create a personal legal disaster. For Bond, the fall became public and relentless. The empire unraveled. The assets went, the headlines changed. The man who had stood at the center of a national triumph became a symbol of corporate excess. There's a particular humiliation in a public business collapse. The same media that once photographed the yacht, the art, the parties, will they start photographing the court steps? Bond was declared bankrupt in 1992. Later, he was imprisoned after fraud convictions. The transformation was almost cinematic. And that's why the story still travels so well to this day. It has everything people remember: sport, money, ego, debt, banks, art, television, fraud, and eventually prison. But entrepreneurs shouldn't watch it like gossip. They should watch it like a structural failure investigation. America's Cup hero, billion-dollar deal maker, media owner, corporate collapse, bankruptcy, prison. But if you reduce the story to scandal, you miss the value. Alan Bond wasn't necessarily trying to commit fraud. He didn't start out that way, certainly. But the worst legal decisions often don't feel evil at the time. They feel practical, and they feel necessary. So what should you take from Alan Bond? First, never treat a personal guarantee like admin. If you sign personally, ask what follows you home. Second, never confuse control with permission. If one entity has money and another entity has a problem, don't assume you can simply move the money because you control both. Third, be most careful when you feel most desperate. The emergency transaction is the one most likely to hurt you later. That is the quiet lesson. Alan Bond's empire didn't fail only because one thing went wrong. It failed because the system became too dependent on the next rescue, on the next refinance, the next assumption, the next belief that the future would fix the present. And eventually, the future didn't arrive on time. It's boring, only until it controls the ending. Professor Punch is for the entrepreneur who wants to understand the structure before the ending is written, not the entrepreneur looking for loopholes. and not the entrepreneur trying to play lawyer. The serious operator who knows they're making real money and wants to stop operating legally blind. If you're making $10,000 a month or more as an entrepreneur or investor, this already matters. That's the point where a lot of founders start telling themselves 3 dangerous things. 1, I'm not rich enough yet. 2, I'll clean it up later. And 3, my advisors will tell me when it matters. But by the time it obviously matters, the weak points may have already been built in. The wrong guarantee, the wrong entity, the wrong contract, the wrong money movement, the wrong advisor question asked too late. That's why we created the Professor Punch Legal Risk Quiz. It takes less than 5 minutes, and it'll help you see where your business may be exposed before the market, a bank, a partner, a creditor, a regulator, or one bad transaction shows you the hard way. Click the link below and get your result for the Legal Risk Quiz. Thank you.